May 19, 2023, Las Vegas, Nevada. A demolition and salvage crew was conducting a final structural inspection of a deteriorating mansion on the city's outskirts before scheduled demolition. The property, located in what had once been an exclusive neighborhood in the 1950s and 60s, had been abandoned for nearly 40 years and had fallen into spectacular decay. The mansion was a haunting testament to abandonment and the passage of time. What had clearly once been an impressive residence belonging to someone of significant wealth now stood as a ruin slowly surrendering to nature and neglect. The façade showed extensive deterioration, walls with large sections of plaster fallen away, revealing the old brick construction beneath. The paint that remained was peeling and faded, giving the exterior a mottled, diseased appearance. The upper balcony, supported by columns that had once been elegant but were now worn and weathered by decades of exposure, showed structural damage and decay. Vegetation had grown wild and uncontrolled across the property. Ivy and creeping vines climbed the walls, wound around the pillars and balconies, transforming the mansion into something that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel rather than suburban Las Vegas. The plants seemed determined to reclaim the structure, pulling it back toward nature. The roof was in terrible condition. Rust had eaten through sections of the metal, and the tiles that remained were broken or displaced. The corrosion was visible even from ground level, evidence of decades without maintenance or repair. The mansion's windows told their own story of abandonment. Many had no glass remaining at all, the panes having been broken by vandals, weather, or simply the passage of time. Others retained their glass, but showed window frames painted in a faded blue color that had once been vibrant, but now looked sad and tired. The combination of missing glass and deteriorated frames gave the building an even more decadent, haunted appearance. The grounds were equally neglected. Tall weeds and wild grass covered nearly the entire front yard, rising to waist height in some areas. Fallen branches from dying trees littered the property. A small pathway that had once provided access to the front entrance was completely overgrown, barely visible beneath the vegetation. The overall impression was of a place where no human had walked in many years, where nature had been allowed to do as it pleased without interference. The soft light of late afternoon illuminated the scene as the inspection crew arrived, creating a striking contrast between the current tranquility of the abandoned property and the turbulent past that the mansion represented. The building seemed frozen in time, a relic from Las Vegas's golden age now standing silent and empty, holding whatever secrets it had accumulated since its owner's mysterious disappearance nearly 6 decades earlier. The demolition had been delayed multiple times over the years due to ownership disputes, legal challenges, and questions about historical preservation. But by 2023, all obstacles had been resolved. The property had been purchased by a development company planning to clear the lot and build new residential units. Before demolition could proceed, however, a thorough structural inspection was required to assess hazards and plan the safest demolition approach. Stephen Martinez, a structural engineer with Harrison Engineering, was conducting the inspection. Stephen had 30 years of experience examining old buildings and had seen his share of abandoned properties in various states of decay. But this mansion was remarkable, even by his standards. The combination of obvious former wealth and complete abandonment created an atmosphere that was both melancholy and unsettling. Stephen worked systematically through the building's interior, which showed the same neglect as the exterior. Ceilings had collapsed in several rooms. Water damage from roof leaks had destroyed floors and walls. Mold covered many surfaces. But beneath the decay, traces of the mansion's former grandeur remained visible. Expensive wood paneling, marble fixtures, elaborate architectural details that spoke of significant investment and refined taste. Around 3:15 p.m., Stephen was examining what appeared to have been a study or office on the mansion's first floor. The room was in better condition than some others, suggesting the roof above this section had held up better than elsewhere. Stephen was measuring wall thickness and checking for structural issues when he noticed something odd about the room's dimensions. Based on the mansion's exterior dimensions and the layout of adjacent rooms, this study should have been approximately 25 feet long. But the interior measurements showed it was only about 17 feet. There were approximately 8 feet of space unaccounted for. Stephen examined the wall at the room's far end more carefully. The wall surface appeared to be wood paneling, similar to other walls in the room. But when Stephen tapped on it at various points, the sound was different, hollow, indicating empty space behind it. Stephen examined the paneling more closely and noticed something he'd initially missed. This section of wall showed slightly different weathering and aging patterns than the surrounding original walls. The difference was subtle, but visible under close inspection. This wall had been constructed later than the room's original walls, perhaps years or even decades later. Stephen called his supervisor and explained what he'd found. After discussion, they decided to carefully remove a section of the paneling to determine what was behind it. Using a crowbar and working carefully to avoid causing unnecessary damage to what might be historically significant construction, Stephen pried away several boards of the wood paneling. Behind the paneling was another wall, drywall that appeared to have been installed in the 1960s based on its type and condition. Stephen carefully cut through this drywall layer and pulled away a section. His flashlight beam penetrated the darkness beyond, revealing a hidden space. The space was a room, approximately 8 feet wide and 10 feet deep. There were no windows. The air that escaped when the wall was breached was stale, musty, carrying the odor of decades of confinement and decay. Stephen shined his flashlight into the room, moving the beam slowly to survey the space. The room contained furniture. A leather armchair sat facing away from the wall opening, positioned as if someone sitting in it would be looking toward the room's far wall. A small side table stood next to the chair, and in that armchair, illuminated by Stephen's flashlight, sat a human skeleton. Stephen immediately backed away from the opening and called 911. By 4 p.m., Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department officers were on site. By 5 p.m., detectives and forensic specialists had arrived to examine what was clearly a death investigation scene that had been sealed away for decades. The discovery made local news that evening and national news by the following morning. A hidden room in an abandoned mansion. A skeleton that had been sealed away for decades. And within days, through identification found with the remains, the revelation that would shock Las Vegas. The skeleton was Daniel Brown, a casino tycoon, who had vanished without explanation in September 1966, 57 years earlier. He'd been here the entire time, sealed in a hidden room in his own mansion, while the world searched for him and speculated about his fate. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in September 1966 involves Las Vegas's golden age, organized crime's control of the casino industry, and a powerful businessman who suddenly vanished. By the end, you'll understand how Daniel Brown disappeared and why it took 57 years to find him. The questions investigators faced were both fascinating and disturbing. How did Daniel end up dead and sealed in a hidden room in his own home. Who had the access and knowledge to create such an elaborate concealment? And could a 57-year-old murder possibly be solved when everyone involved was likely deceased? Daniel Robert Brown was 54 years old in September 1966, one of Las Vegas's most successful independent casino owners during an era when organized crime controlled much of the city's gambling industry. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall with a solid build that had thickened somewhat in middle age. His hair had turned from brown to distinguished gray in his late 40s. His eyes were blue, described by those who knew him as sharp and calculating in business but warm with family and friends. Daniel dressed impeccably in expensive tailored suits, silk ties, and polished leather shoes. He wore a gold Rolex watch, a status symbol that announced success in Las Vegas's competitive casino world. He drove luxury cars and lived in a mansion that he'd had custom-built in 1958 when his casino business was thriving. Everything about Daniel's presentation communicated wealth, success, and power. Daniel had been born in March 1912 in Los Angeles, California, the son of middle-class parents. His father worked in sales, and his mother was a homemaker. Daniel grew up during the Depression years, watching his family struggle financially like millions of other Americans. The experience instilled in him a fierce determination to achieve financial security and success. After graduating high school in 1930, Daniel held various jobs through the 1930s, sales positions, restaurant work, anything that provided income during difficult economic times. In 1941, at age 29, Daniel took a job as a blackjack dealer at a small casino in downtown Las Vegas. Las Vegas in 1941 was still a small desert town, but gambling was legal, and the casino industry was beginning to develop. Daniel proved to be an excellent dealer, skilled with cards, good with customers, reliable and honest in handling money. More importantly, he studied the casino business intensely. He learned how games operated, how odds worked, how casinos made money, how they managed customers and employees. He watched how successful casinos were run and how unsuccessful ones failed. Through the 1940s, Daniel worked his way up through casino management. He became a pit boss, then a shift manager, then an assistant casino manager. He saved money carefully. He made connections throughout Las Vegas's growing gambling industry. He learned which people had power and influence. He learned how the system worked, both the legal system and the less legal aspects of how Las Vegas actually operated. In 1952, at age 40, Daniel achieved his goal. He became a casino owner. With money he'd saved and money borrowed from investors whose identities he never disclosed, Daniel purchased a small, struggling casino on the Las Vegas Strip. He renamed it the Golden Sands Casino and set about transforming it into a profitable operation. Daniel's approach combined excellent customer service with sophisticated marketing and tight financial management. The Golden Sands offered good odds on table games, attracting serious gamblers. The casino had excellent entertainment, bringing in popular performers. The hotel rooms were well-maintained and reasonably priced. The restaurants served good food. Within 3 years, the Golden Sands was profitable and growing. In 1955, at age 43, Daniel married Patricia Wilson, a cocktail waitress he'd met at the Golden Sands. Patricia was 28, beautiful, and intelligent. Their marriage was happy by all accounts. They had one child together, a daughter named Susan, born in 1956. By 1966, Susan was 10 years old. Daniel was devoted to his family, but also intensely focused on business. The Golden Sands continued growing through the late 1950s and early 1960s. Daniel expanded the casino floor, added more hotel rooms, improved the entertainment offerings. By the mid-1960s, the Golden Sands was one of the more successful independent casinos in Las Vegas, generating substantial revenue. But success in Las Vegas during this era came with complications. The casino industry was heavily influenced by organized crime. Major casinos were either owned by or had significant financial connections to criminal organizations from Chicago, New York, and other cities. These organizations used Las Vegas casinos to launder money, to generate legitimate income from illegal enterprises, and to expand their power and influence. Daniel operated the Golden Sands as an independent owner, but he wasn't naive about the reality of Las Vegas. He understood that organized crime controlled much of the city. He paid the necessary tributes and respect to maintain his independence. He hired the people he was told to hire. He looked the other way when he was supposed to look the other way. He maintained friendly relationships with powerful figures who could cause him serious problems if he crossed them. But by 1966, Daniel's independence was becoming a problem. Larger casino corporations were consolidating control of the Las Vegas Strip. Organized crime families wanted to either control or eliminate independent operators like Daniel. The Golden Sands was profitable, which made it attractive to those who wanted to acquire it. Daniel was being pressured to sell, sometimes politely, sometimes less politely. Daniel built his mansion in 1958 at the height of his success. The property was located in an exclusive area on Las Vegas's outskirts, away from the Strip's noise and crowds. The mansion was substantial, approximately 6,000 square feet, with 5 bedrooms, multiple bathrooms, a large kitchen, formal dining room, living room, study, and various other spaces. The architecture was contemporary for the era, with clean lines and large windows that brought in natural light and provided views of the desert landscape. The mansion's interior was furnished, expensively, with high-quality furniture, artwork, and decorations. The study where Daniel's hidden room would later be discovered was his private space, lined with bookshelves, containing a large desk, decorated with memorabilia from the Golden Sands. Daniel spent significant time in this study, working on casino business, making phone calls, reviewing financial documents. Those who knew Daniel in the mid-1960s described him as increasingly tense and worried. The pressure to sell the Golden Sands was constant. Daniel loved his casino and didn't want to sell, but he also understood that refusing powerful people could have serious consequences. He had several meetings with various individuals who expressed interest in purchasing the Golden Sands. Some meetings were cordial, others were veiled threats. Patricia later recalled that Daniel had seemed particularly stressed during the summer of 1966. He was spending more time at the casino and less time at home. He was receiving phone calls at odd hours. He occasionally made cryptic comments about business problems, but wouldn't provide details, telling Patricia not to worry. In early September, Daniel told Patricia he was dealing with some difficult negotiations, but expected everything would be resolved soon. On September 7, 1966, a Wednesday, Daniel seemed to reach some kind of resolution or decision. He spent most of that day at the Golden Sands, meeting with his senior staff and reviewing operations. He told several people that he was taking care of some things and would have important news soon. His mood seemed a mixture of determination and resignation, as if he'd made a difficult choice and was preparing to follow through with it. On September 8, 1966, a Thursday, Daniel worked at the Golden Sands through the evening as usual. Around 11:45 p.m., he told his casino manager he was going home and would see him the following day. Daniel's Tycoon driver who'd worked for him for several years, drove Daniel from the Golden Sands to his mansion, a trip that took approximately 35 minutes given the late hour and light traffic. The driver later told police that he dropped Daniel at the mansion's front entrance around 12:30 a.m. on Friday, September 9th. He watched Daniel unlock the front door, enter the house, and close the door behind him. The driver then returned to the casino to park the car, as was his usual routine. That was the last confirmed sighting of Daniel Brown. By the next afternoon, when Daniel failed to appear at the Golden Sands as expected and couldn't be reached by phone, his staff began to worry. By evening, with Daniel still missing and Patricia unable to contact him from her trip visiting family, the concern became alarm. By Saturday morning, the mystery that would last 57 years had begun. September 8th, 1966. A Thursday in Las Vegas. The weather that day had been typical for early September in the Nevada desert, hot and dry, with temperatures reaching 104 degrees Fahrenheit during the afternoon, cooling to the mid-80s by midnight. The sky was clear with no precipitation. It was comfortable weather for late evening, pleasant for the brief walk from car to front door. Daniel Brown spent most of Thursday at the Golden Sands Casino, as was his normal routine. He arrived around 10 a.m. and spent the day supervising operations, meeting with staff, reviewing financial reports, and handling the constant stream of decisions required to run a successful casino. Thursday nights were typically busy at Las Vegas casinos, with both tourists and locals gambling, watching shows, dining, and enjoying the entertainment. Daniel's office at the Golden Sands was on the casino's second floor, overlooking the gaming floor below. From his office, he could monitor operations and be available when needed. Staff members who worked with Daniel that Thursday later reported that he'd seemed normal, focused on business, perhaps a bit preoccupied, but not unusually worried or afraid. He'd made several phone calls throughout the day, but hadn't discussed their content with anyone. Around 6 p.m., Daniel left his office and spent several hours on the casino floor, moving between the gaming tables, chatting with customers, observing dealers and pit bosses, maintaining the visible presence that successful casino owners cultivated. Customer relations mattered in the casino business. High rollers wanted to feel appreciated. Regular customers wanted to feel recognized. Daniel was skilled at providing that personal touch. Around 9 p.m., Daniel returned to his office and spent 2 hours working on paperwork and making more phone calls. Around 11 p.m., he went back down to the casino floor for a final check of operations. Thursday nights typically ran smoothly, and this Thursday was no exception. The casino was busy, but not overwhelmed. The customers seemed happy. The staff was performing well. Around 11:45 p.m., Daniel found his casino manager, Robert Sullivan, and told him he was heading home. This was completely normal. Daniel typically left the Golden Sands between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., depending on how busy things were. Robert later recalled that Daniel had seemed relaxed, perhaps even relieved, as if some burden had been lifted. Daniel's parting words were routine. "See you tomorrow. Call if anything comes up." Daniel's driver, James Martinez, was waiting with the car, a 1965 Cadillac Sedan DeVille in black, one of Daniel's 2 personal vehicles. James had driven for Daniel for 4 years and knew the routine well. They left the Golden Sands parking lot around 11:50 p.m. and took Las Vegas Boulevard south, then turned onto the route that led to Daniel's mansion. The drive was uneventful. James and Daniel chatted casually about casino business and Las Vegas news. Traffic was light at Tweetreezy that hour. They arrived at the mansion around 12:30 a.m. James pulled into the circular driveway at the mansion's front entrance. Daniel thanked James, wished him good night, and got out of the car. James watched as Daniel walked to the front door. Daniel unlocked the door using his key, pushed it open, and entered the mansion. The door closed behind him. James waited for a moment, as was his habit, making sure Daniel was safely inside before leaving. Through the mansion's windows, James saw lights come on in the entry hall and then in what appeared to be the first-floor hallway. Everything appeared normal. James drove away, returning to the Golden Sands to park the car in the employee lot before driving his own car home. Patricia Brown, Daniel's wife, was not home that night. She had traveled to Los Angeles on Tuesday, September 6th, to visit her mother, who'd been ill. She'd planned to return to Las Vegas on Saturday, September 10th. She'd spoken with Daniel by phone on Wednesday evening, and everything had seemed fine. Susan, their 10-year-old daughter, had gone with Patricia to Los Angeles for the trip. This meant Daniel was alone in the mansion when he arrived home shortly after midnight on Friday, September 9th. The mansion had no live-in staff. A housekeeper came during weekdays to clean and maintain the property, but she didn't sleep there. At night, when Patricia and Susan were traveling, Daniel was the only person in the large house. Friday morning, September 9th, Daniel was expected at the Golden Sands by 10 a.m. for a scheduled meeting with his accountant. When 10 a.m. came and went, with no Daniel and no phone call, his casino manager Robert Sullivan began to worry. Daniel was punctual and professional. Missing a meeting without notification was completely out of character. Robert tried calling Daniel's home phone. No answer. He tried again at 10:30 a.m. No answer. At 11 a.m., still with no word from Daniel, Robert called Patricia in Los Angeles. Patricia said she hadn't spoken with Daniel since Wednesday evening and hadn't expected to talk with him again until Friday evening. She was surprised he hadn't shown up for his meeting. Patricia tried calling the mansion from Los Angeles. No answer. She tried several more times over the next hour. No answer. By 12:30 p.m., with Daniel still unreachable and no one having seen or heard from him, both Patricia and Robert were genuinely alarmed. This was completely unlike Daniel. Robert drove from the Golden Sands to the mansion, arriving around 1:15 p.m. The Cadillac was parked in the garage. Daniel's driver had put it there after dropping Daniel off. Daniel's personal car, a 1964 Thunderbird, was also in the garage. Both vehicles were present, suggesting Daniel hadn't driven anywhere. Robert knocked on the front door. No response. He knocked louder and called Daniel's name. No response. He tried the door. It was locked. He walked around the mansion, checking windows and other doors. Everything was locked. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no damage to doors or locks. Robert called Patricia again. She authorized him to use the spare key she kept hidden in the garden shed to enter the house and check on Daniel. Robert located the spare key, unlocked the front door, and entered cautiously, calling Daniel's name. The mansion was silent. Robert searched the first floor, living room, dining room, kitchen, study, other rooms. No Daniel. No sign of a struggle. Everything appeared normal. He searched the second floor. Master bedroom, other bedrooms, bathrooms. No Daniel. No sign of disturbance. He even checked the basement. Nothing. Robert Sullivan immediately called the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Officers arrived at the mansion within 20 minutes and began a missing person investigation. By evening, with Daniel still missing and no explanation apparent, detectives from the department's major crimes unit took over the case. The investigation was led by Detective William Thompson, a 15-year veteran who'd investigated numerous missing person cases and had experience with Las Vegas's darker elements, organized crime, unsolved disappearances, and violence that often went unreported. Detective Thompson understood that Daniel Brown's disappearance could be ordinary or could be connected to the murky world of casino ownership and organized crime control. The initial investigation focused on the mansion itself. If Daniel had entered the mansion around 12:30 a.m. and never left, then something must have happened inside. Police conducted a thorough search. Every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. They found no body. They found no sign of violence or struggle. They found no indication that Daniel had been harmed or had left voluntarily. Daniel's wallet was on the dresser in the master bedroom, containing his driver's license and approximately $300 cash. His car keys were on the kitchen counter. His Rolex watch was not present. He'd apparently been wearing it when he disappeared. His wedding ring was also not present, also apparently worn when he disappeared. Several of his expensive suits were missing from his closet, suggesting he'd been wearing one when he disappeared. There was no forced entry to the mansion. All doors and windows had been locked when Robert Sullivan arrived Friday afternoon. No glass was broken, no locks were damaged. If someone had entered the mansion to harm Daniel, they'd either been let in by Daniel or had keys to the property. Detective Thompson interviewed everyone who'd had recent contact with Daniel. James Martinez, the driver, confirmed he'd dropped Daniel at the mansion around 12:30 a.m. Friday morning and had seen him enter the house. James had noticed nothing unusual. No other cars at the mansion, no signs of anyone else present. Nothing that suggested danger. Robert Sullivan, the IPP, casino manager, confirmed Daniel had seemed normal Thursday evening at the Golden Sands, perhaps even relaxed. Daniel had given no indication he was planning to leave, or that he was afraid of anything. Robert said Daniel had been dealing with pressure to sell the Golden Sands, but hadn't seemed to think it was an immediate threat. Patricia Brown, interviewed by phone in Los Angeles, said Daniel had been stressed about business, but hadn't expressed fear for his safety. She said their marriage was happy, and she had no reason to believe Daniel would voluntarily disappear. She and Susan returned to Las Vegas on Saturday to cooperate with the investigation. Detective Thompson investigated whether Daniel might have staged his disappearance. Perhaps he'd left the mansion through a window or back door, locking it behind him, and fled to escape financial problems or threats. But investigation of Daniel's finances showed the Golden Sands was profitable, and Daniel had no significant debts. His bank accounts showed no unusual withdrawals or transfers. There was no indication he'd been preparing to disappear. The FBI became involved in the investigation due to Daniel's position in the casino industry and the possibility of organized crime involvement. FBI Special Agent Robert Harrison, who'd been investigating organized crime's control of Las Vegas casinos, took the lead on the federal investigation. Agent Harrison explored whether Daniel had been planning to cooperate with federal authorities. The FBI was building cases against organized crime figures who controlled casinos and was seeking witnesses willing to testify. If Daniel had agreed to cooperate and criminal organizations had learned of it, his life would have been in serious danger. But Agent Harrison found no evidence Daniel had contacted the FBI or had been considering cooperation. The investigation examined whether Daniel had been killed by organized crime figures who wanted the Golden Sands. Several informants suggested Daniel had been resisting pressure to sell the casino to interests connected to Chicago and New York crime families. But no specific evidence connected anyone to Daniel's disappearance. And, critically, no body was found, making it difficult to prove a murder had occurred. Investigators searched the mansion grounds extensively. They excavated areas where a body might be buried. They drained the swimming pool and searched it. They brought in search dogs. They found nothing. Daniel's body, if he was dead, was not buried on the mansion property. As weeks passed with no progress, the investigation stalled. There were no witnesses to whatever happened inside the mansion. There was no body. There was no physical evidence. There was no clear suspect, with both motive and opportunity. Daniel Brown had simply vanished from his locked home without leaving any trace. By December 1966, 3 months after Daniel's disappearance, the active investigation had effectively ended. The case remained officially open, but without new information, there was nothing more investigators could do. The file was stored in police archives, one of many unsolved missing person cases in Las Vegas's history. Patricia Brown and Susan lived with terrible uncertainty. Was Daniel dead? Had he been kidnapped and was being held somewhere? Had he somehow left voluntarily, abandoning his family? Not knowing was perhaps worse than knowing the worst. Patricia couldn't remarry because she was still legally married. She couldn't access all of Daniel's assets because there was no death certificate. She existed in legal and emotional limbo. The Golden Sands Casino continued operating under Patricia's management for several months, but without Daniel's leadership and expertise, it struggled. By 1967, facing financial difficulties and continued pressure from those who wanted to acquire it, Patricia sold the Golden Sands. The casino changed hands several times over subsequent years and was eventually demolished in the 1990s to make way for a larger resort development. In 1970, 4 years after Daniel's disappearance, Patricia petitioned the court to have her husband declared legally dead. The court granted the petition. Daniel Robert Brown was officially declared deceased as of September 9, 1966. The declaration allowed Patricia to settle Daniel's estate and move forward with her life. She remained in Las Vegas for several more years before eventually moving to California. Patricia never remarried. She died in 2008 at age 81, 42 years after her husband's disappearance, without ever learning what had happened to him. The mansion stood empty for several years after Patricia moved away. It was sold in the late 1970s to new owners who occupied it briefly before abandoning it in the early 1980s when they encountered financial difficulties. The mansion then sat vacant for 4 decades, slowly deteriorating while ownership passed through various entities. Vandals damaged it. Weather eroded it. Vegetation overtook it. The mansion became a ghost, a haunted relic of Las Vegas's golden age. And inside that mansion, in a hidden room behind a false wall in the study, Daniel Brown sat in his leather armchair, sealed away from the world, waiting 57 years to be discovered. The 57 years between Daniel Brown's disappearance in September 1966 and the discovery of his remains in May 2023 saw Las Vegas transform completely. The city that Daniel had known, where independent casino owners could build fortunes, and where organized crime controlled much of the gambling industry, evolved into a corporate entertainment destination where massive publicly traded companies owned vast resort complexes. The FBI's investigations into organized crime's control of casinos led to major prosecutions in the 1970s and 80s. The implementation of strict gaming regulations and the entry of legitimate corporations into the casino business gradually pushed out organized crime influence. By the 21st century, Las Vegas had been transformed from a city of mob-connected casinos into a corporate entertainment center. Patricia Brown, Daniel's widow, raised Susan as a single mother, always carrying the pain of not knowing what had happened to her husband. She maintained that Daniel would never have abandoned his family voluntarily, that something terrible must have happened to him, but without proof, without a body, without answers, she could only speculate. When Patricia died in 2008, she took her questions and her grief with her. Susan Brown grew up shadowed by her father's mysterious disappearance. She'd been only 10 years old when Daniel vanished, old enough to remember him clearly, but too young to understand what had happened. As an adult, Susan moved away from Las Vegas, building her own life and family in California. She had 2 children, Daniel's grandchildren, who never knew their grandfather except as a tragic mystery from family history. The Golden Sands Casino that Daniel had built was sold in 1967 and changed hands multiple times through subsequent decades. The property was eventually purchased by a large casino corporation in the late 1980s and demolished in 1994 to make room for a new mega resort. Every physical trace of Daniel's life's work was erased, replaced by a massive modern casino complex that bore no resemblance to the Golden Sands. Daniel's mansion stood as a monument to abandonment and decay. After Patricia moved away in the 1970s, the property was sold to a couple who intended to renovate and occupy it. But they encountered financial difficulties and abandoned the project in the early 1980s, leaving the mansion empty. Ownership passed to a bank through foreclosure, then to various investment entities that held the property but did nothing with it. Through the 1980s and 90s, the mansion slowly deteriorated. Vandals broke windows and damaged the interior. Water from roof leaks caused extensive damage. Mold grew in damp areas. The property became known locally as the Haunted Mansion, a decrepit relic that teenagers dared each other to enter, that homeless people occasionally used for shelter, that represented what happened when wealth and pride were abandoned to time. The vegetation grew wild. The lawn that had once been carefully maintained became a field of weeds. Desert plants, creosote bushes, desert willow, mesquite invaded the property. Ivy and other climbing plants found purchase on the walls and began their slow transformation of the structure into something that looked like an archaeological ruin rather than a 20th-century mansion. The neighborhood around the mansion changed too. What had been an exclusive area in the 1950s and 60s became less desirable as Las Vegas expanded in other directions. By the 2000s, the area was a mixture of older properties, some maintained and some neglected, surrounded by commercial development and light industrial facilities. The mansion stood out as particularly derelict among its neighbors. Various proposals to purchase, renovate, or demolish the mansion were made over the years, but none came to fruition until 2022. A development company purchased the property with plans to demolish the mansion and build modern townhouses on the lot. The location had become attractive again due to Las Vegas's explosive growth, and the large lot the mansion occupied was valuable real estate. Demolition permits were obtained in early 2023. Before demolition could proceed, a final structural inspection was required to assess hazards, identify materials requiring special disposal, and plan the demolition approach. This inspection was scheduled for May 2023, May 19, 2023. Stephen Martinez of Harrison Engineering arrived at the abandoned mansion around 9 a.m. to conduct the structural inspection. Stephen had been warned the property was in poor condition, but seeing it in person was still striking. The mansion looked like something from a horror movie, overgrown, decaying, barely recognizable as having once been a luxurious residence. Stephen spent the morning working through the mansion's exterior and structural elements, documenting the extensive damage and decay. The roof was in terrible condition and would need to be treated as hazardous during demolition. The walls showed significant deterioration. The foundation had some issues, but was structurally sound enough that demolition could proceed safely. Around 2 p.m., Stephen began inspecting the mansion's interior rooms, one by one. Most showed extensive water damage, mold, and decay. The furniture that remained was ruined. The floors were damaged. The ceilings had collapsed in several areas. It was sad to see what had clearly been beautiful spaces reduced to ruins. Around 3:15 p.m., Stephen entered what appeared to have been a study or office on the first floor. This room was in better condition than most others, suggesting the roof above it had held up better and protected it from the worst water damage. The room retained its wood paneling on most walls, though the wood was faded and showed water, staining in places. Stephen was measuring the room's dimensions when he noticed the discrepancy. According to the mansion's architectural plans he'd obtained from county records, this study should have been approximately 25 feet in length. But his measurements showed it was only about 17 feet. There were 8 feet unaccounted for. Stephen examined the wall at the far end of the study more carefully. It was covered with wood paneling that matched the other walls. But when Stephen tapped on it with his knuckles at various points, the sound was distinctly hollow, indicating empty space behind the wall rather than solid structure. Stephen took photographs and notes, then examined the paneling more closely. The wood grain patterns and weathering suggested this wall section had been installed at a different time than the surrounding original paneling. The difference was subtle but visible under careful inspection. Someone had constructed this wall after the original room had been built. Stephen called his supervisor and explained the situation. Given that this was an old mansion with potential historical significance, they agreed Stephen should carefully remove a section of the paneling to determine what was behind the wall. If it was simply a closed-off storage area or an architectural quirk, they'd document it and proceed with demolition. But they needed to know what they were dealing with. Stephen used a crowbar to carefully pry away several vertical boards of the wood paneling. The boards came away relatively easily. They'd been nailed in place, but time had loosened the connections. Behind the paneling was a layer of drywall, the type used in construction during the 1960s and 70s. Stephen cut through this drywall using a utility knife and pulled away a large section. Behind the drywall was darkness and stale air. Stephen shined his flashlight through the opening. The beam illuminated a room approximately 8 feet wide and 10 feet deep. The room had no windows. The walls were the mansion's original construction, plaster over brick. The air that escaped through the opening smelled musty, stale, like a tomb that had been sealed for decades. Stephen's flashlight beam moved around the room, revealing its contents. There was furniture, a leather armchair positioned facing toward the room's far wall, away from the opening Stephen had created. A small wooden side table stood next to the armchair. On the side table was a glass, a crystal, tumbler of the type used for whiskey or bourbon. Next to the table on the floor was a bottle, empty, appearing to be liquor. And in the armchair, sitting in a relaxed position with the head tilted slightly to one side, was a complete human skeleton. Stephen immediately backed away from the opening and called 911. Police arrived within 15 minutes. By 4 p.m., detectives and crime scene investigators were on site. By evening, the discovery was being treated as a death investigation, involving remains that had clearly been concealed for many years. The forensic examination would take several days, but preliminary observations told a compelling story. Before anyone entered the hidden room, extensive photography documented everything from every possible angle through the opening Stephen had created. Then crime scene investigators carefully removed additional paneling to create a larger access point while preserving as much of the construction as possible for evidence. The hidden room was approximately 8 feet wide, 10 feet deep, and 8 feet high. The walls were the mansion's original plaster and brick construction. There was no window. The room was completely enclosed. The floor was the same hardwood that covered the rest of the first floor. The ceiling was plaster, showing some water staining but otherwise intact. The leather armchair in which the skeleton sat was a high-quality piece from the 1950s or 60s, the type of furniture a wealthy person would have owned. The leather had dried and cracked after decades in the sealed room, but the chair's structure was intact. The skeleton sat in the chair in a position that appeared relaxed, or perhaps unconscious. Slumped slightly, head tilted to the left, arms resting on the chair's arms. The skeleton was complete and fully articulated. The skull showed significant damage to the posterior aspect, the back of the head, with a depressed fracture approximately 3 inches in diameter. The bone was pushed inward with radiating fracture lines extending from the impact point. This was consistent with a powerful blow from a blunt object, a weapon, a heavy tool, or similar implement. The skeleton bore remnants of clothing. Metal buttons were scattered across the rib cage and near the arms, the kind of buttons used on dress shirts and suit jackets. A corroded metal zipper lay near the pelvic area, indicating trousers. The metal buckle of a belt was still in position at the waist. A few small fragments of fabric remained, tiny pieces of what appeared to have been high-quality wool or silk, the type used in expensive suits. But the fabric itself had almost completely decomposed after 57 years, leaving primarily the non-degradable metal components that had once held the clothing together. On the skeleton's left wrist was a watch, a gold Rolex, surprisingly well preserved due to gold's resistance to corrosion. The watch had stopped, its mechanism no longer functioning, but the case and band showed minimal deterioration. On the left hand's fourth finger was a gold wedding ring, also well preserved. In the area where the skeleton's inside jacket pocket would have been, investigators found the deteriorated remnants of a leather wallet. The leather itself had dried and cracked severely, falling apart when touched. But within the wallet's remains were items that had partially survived. A driver's license, the plastic severely yellowed and brittle but still intact enough to be legible, showed a photograph that time had faded but not completely erased. The license identified the holder as Daniel Robert Brown, with a Las Vegas address, born March 1912, issued in 1964, and valid through March 1968. Also in the wallet were fragments of paper currency, severely degraded, darkened with age, but with enough detail remaining to identify them as United States bills from the 1960s. The exact denominations and amounts were impossible to determine due to deterioration, but the presence of money confirmed this person had been carrying cash when they died. On the small side table next to the armchair sat the crystal tumbler Stephen had seen with his flashlight. The glass was dusty but intact. Forensic specialists carefully collected it for analysis. Next to the table on the floor was an empty bourbon bottle, the label mostly deteriorated, but enough remaining to identify it as premium bourbon, the expensive type wealthy people drank. The construction of the false wall that had concealed this room told its own story. Someone had built a frame from 2x4 lumber, covered it with drywall on the room-facing side, and then covered the exterior with wood paneling that matched the study's original walls. The construction was competent, but not professional, suggesting someone with basic construction knowledge but not necessarily a contractor. The wall had been nailed in place securely enough to last 57 years. After 57 years sealed behind a false wall in his own mansion, Daniel Brown had been found. The casino tycoon who'd vanished in September 1966 had been here the entire time, sitting in a leather armchair in a hidden room, waiting for demolition to finally reveal his resting place. The discovery of Daniel Brown's remains sparked immediate investigation by Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's Cold Case Unit. Understanding what had happened 57 years earlier would require careful forensic analysis and research into Daniel's life and the circumstances of his disappearance. The forensic examination of the skeletal remains provided clear evidence about how Daniel had died. The skull showed a depressed fracture on the posterior aspect, the back of the head, approximately 3 inches in diameter. The bone was pushed inward with multiple radiating fracture lines. This type of injury was consistent with a single powerful blow from a blunt object, something heavy like a pipe, a bat, a crowbar, or a similar weapon. The location of the injury, back of the head, indicated Daniel had been struck from behind. He likely never saw his attacker or had any opportunity to defend himself. The force required to create such a fracture would have caused immediate unconsciousness and likely death within minutes from traumatic brain injury, even if medical help had been available. The forensic conclusion was unambiguous. Daniel Brown had been murdered by blunt force trauma to the head. He'd been struck from behind with significant force, had died quickly, and his body had been concealed in the hidden room where it remained undiscovered for 57 years. The sealed room itself told a story. The construction of the false wall indicated it had been built specifically to conceal the room and its contents. Someone had taken the time and effort to frame a wall, install drywall, and cover it with paneling that matched the study's original walls. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was planned and executed deliberately. The furniture and objects in the room suggested Daniel may have been in this space when he was killed, or that his body was placed here shortly after death. The leather armchair, the side table, the bourbon bottle, the crystal glass. These items suggested Daniel might have been relaxing with a drink when he was attacked. Or perhaps the scene had been staged to make it appear that way. Historical research provided crucial context. The mansion had been searched thoroughly by police in September 1966, when Daniel disappeared, but the false wall had successfully concealed the hidden room. The wall had appeared to be original construction, part of the study's structure. Police had measured the room, but hadn't noticed the discrepancy between the exterior and interior dimensions, or if they'd noticed, they'd assumed it was architectural variance rather than hidden space. Building permits and construction records showed no authorized work done on the mansion between when Daniel had it built in 1958 and his disappearance in 1966. This meant whoever constructed the false wall did so without permits, probably quickly and secretly after Daniel's death. Investigators developed a reconstruction of what had happened. On September 9, 1966, Daniel returned home around 12:30 a.m. as confirmed by his driver. He entered the mansion and was alone. Patricia and Susan were in Los Angeles. At some point shortly after arriving home, Daniel was in his study. Perhaps he was having a drink and relaxing after a long day. Perhaps he was working on papers or making phone calls. Someone else was in the mansion, either someone who'd been waiting inside or someone who'd arrived shortly after Daniel. This person had a key to the mansion or had been let in by Daniel because there was no forced entry. This person approached Daniel from behind, while Daniel was in his study, and struck him in the back of the head with a heavy object, killing him. The killer then faced the problem of disposing of Daniel's body. Simply leaving it to be found would immediately trigger a murder investigation and potentially identify the killer. Taking the body elsewhere risked being seen. The solution was to hide the body in place, in the mansion, in a way that it wouldn't be discovered. The killer moved Daniel's body to the small room that adjoined the ED study. This room had been a storage closet or small office. The killer placed Daniel's body in the leather armchair, perhaps staged the bourbon bottle and glass to make the scene appear peaceful, and then sealed the room. The killer constructed a false wall across the doorway to the small room, creating the appearance that the study ended where the false wall stood. This work would have taken several hours, framing the wall, installing drywall, attaching paneling. The killer probably worked through the night and into Friday morning. By the time Daniel's staff at the Golden Sands began trying to reach him Friday morning, the false wall was complete, and Daniel's body was sealed away. The killer then left the mansion, locking it behind them with keys they either had or had taken from Daniel. When Robert Sullivan arrived Friday afternoon to check on Daniel, the mansion appeared empty and undisturbed because the false wall successfully concealed the hidden room and body. Who killed Daniel Brown? After 57 years, with everyone involved long deceased, identifying the specific killer was impossible. But investigators and forensic specialists developed several theories based on evidence and historical context. The killer had to be someone with access to the mansion. Someone who had keys or whom Daniel would admit at 12:30 a.m. without suspicion. This suggested someone Daniel knew well: family, close friend, employee, or business associate. The killer had to have construction knowledge or skills sufficient to build a convincing false wall in several hours. This suggested someone who'd worked in construction, or had handy skills, or someone who'd sought help from such a person. The killer had to have a motive to want Daniel dead. The most obvious motive was the Golden Sands Casino. Daniel had been resisting pressure to sell. Various parties wanted to acquire it. Killing Daniel would remove the obstacle and make the casino available for purchase. The investigation in 1966 had never identified a strong suspect because police were looking for evidence that Daniel had left the mansion or been removed from it. They searched for body disposal, for signs of abduction, for indications Daniel had fled voluntarily. They never imagined Daniel had been killed inside the mansion and sealed into a hidden room within it. For Daniel's family, the discovery brought closure after 57 years of painful uncertainty. Susan Brown, who'd been 10 years old when her father vanished and was now 67, was contacted by police when the remains were identified. DNA comparison between Susan's samples and the skeletal remains confirmed familial relationship consistent with parent-child. Susan, who'd spent her entire adult life not knowing what happened to her father, finally had answers. Not complete answers, not the name of who killed him or why specifically, but at least she knew her father was dead, knew how he'd died, and could, finally, properly bury him. Daniel Brown's remains were released to the family in June 2023. On June 24th, 56 years and 9 months after his murder, Daniel was buried in a Las Vegas cemetery in a plot Patricia had purchased decades earlier, hoping someday to bury her husband. Patricia herself was buried in California, but the family arranged for a memorial marker in Las Vegas, noting both Daniel and Patricia's names. The gravestone erected for Daniel acknowledged his life and the strange circumstances of his death. Daniel Robert Brown, 1912–1966, casino pioneer, found after 57 years, finally at rest. The mansion where Daniel was found was not immediately demolished as planned. The discovery of the remains and the historical significance of the case led to delays while authorities and historical preservation groups debated the building's fate. Ultimately, in late 2023, the decision was made to demolish the mansion, but to preserve the façade study where Daniel was found, and the false wall as part of a small museum exhibit about Las Vegas history. The Rolex watch found on Daniel's wrist was returned to Susan. The gold wedding ring was also returned. These items perfectly preserved due to gold's properties, were the only physical objects that connected Susan to her father across the 57 years of his concealment. So, what really happened to Daniel Brown on September 9, 1966? Based on available evidence, we know he returned home around 12:30 a.m. We know he was struck from behind and killed by blunt force trauma to the head. We know his body was sealed in a hidden room in his own study and concealed behind a false wall that successfully hid him for nearly 6 decades. What we cannot know with certainty is who specifically killed him or the exact motive. Those details died with everyone involved decades ago. We can only determine that someone with access to Daniel's mansion and knowledge of his routines killed him and successfully concealed the crime for 57 years. Daniel Brown's story reminds us that houses can hold secrets in their walls, that mysteries can remain hidden in plain sight for generations, and that sometimes demolition and development reveal truths that seemed permanently lost. It reminds us of Las Vegas's golden age, when independent casino owners could build fortunes, and when organized crime's influence created an atmosphere where violence was sometimes the solution to business problems. After 57 years sealed in darkness behind a false wall, Daniel Brown has been brought into the light. His family finally knows what happened. His grave is finally occupied. The casino tycoon who entered his mansion on a September night in 1966 and never emerged has been found and laid to rest. The false wall that concealed him for more than half a century has given up its secret, and Las Vegas has given up one more piece of its hidden history. Rest in peace, Daniel Robert Brown. Your long wait behind that wall is over. Your daughter knows what happened, and you're finally where you should have been all along, in a marked grave, with your name and story known, your memory preserved.